Scarr.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I rise to speak in favour of this private member's bill, and I congratulate my dear friend and colleague, Julian Leeser MP, for his role in relation to advocating for this, and also, of course, Senator Sarah Henderson, who has been at the forefront of this debate. I'll make a number of points in relation to my contribution. What I want to say at the start is to respond to the point which has been made by some members who've spoken against this bill. And they ask, well, why have an inquiry just looking at the rise of anti-Semitism on our universities and how universities have managed that issue? And I say to you this, quite simply, our Australian Jewish community is asking us to convene this inquiry. Our Australian Jewish community is asking us, the Australian Parliament, to convene this inquiry. And I think when any part of our community, of our society, exhorts us to establish an inquiry into issues relating to their victimisation, the intimidation of that group, the harassment of that group, and look to us, the Australian Senate, to lead the way, to set up a judicial inquiry with appropriate powers, with appropriate impartiality, to look at a concern, to look at an issue of particular concern to them. I think we have a moral obligation to reflect very, very carefully on that request, wherever it comes from. And I want to quote from the representatives of the Australian Council of Australian Jewry, which is the federal representative body of the Jewish community in Australia. So this is the peak body, the Executive Council of Australian Jewry. This is what they've said in relation to this private member's bill. A judicial inquiry, as originally called for in May by Mr Leeser, would allow Jewish students and staff to give evidence in a closed hearing without having to fear reprisals from the fanatical fringe of anti-Israel or Jew-hating students, or victimisation from anti-Israel and anti-Semitic faculty members. There would be no opportunity for political grandstanding by any party, and the sole focus would be on getting to the truth." End quote. And just focus on some elements of that statement made by our Jewish community calling for this inquiry, calling for this bill to be passed. There is a fear. There is a fear that if Jewish students and staff do not give evidence, are not provided the opportunity to give evidence in a closed hearing, that they will be subject to reprisals and further intimidation. This is very sobering. And I say to those opposite, you should carefully consider your position before you vote against this private member's bill, because the Australian Jewish community is calling for this judicial inquiry into anti-Semitism on our campuses and how our universities are managing this issue. So that's the first point. Second point I'd like to make is, on the same day that Julian Leeser MP announced his intention to bring forward this bill, I actually attended my old university, the University of Queensland, at the invitation of the organisers of Camp Shalom, to engage in a silent protest with them in response to the anti-Semitism they were seeing on my own university campus, University of Queensland. And I participated in that nighttime silent protest, and we went silently to the building with the Office of the Vice-Chancellor and held up signs that simply said, "Keep us safe." That's all the Jewish students and academics were seeking, a commitment from the university to keep them safe. And even in the course of us engaging in that silent protest, there was vile abuse directed at the students and the faculty members who are participating in that silent procession. Even in the course of that silent procession, there was abuse, vile abuse. And I commend all the participants in that silent protest for their discipline in terms of ensuring that they didn't do anything to respond to that violent abuse. There was dignity. There was dignity in that silence. I subsequently wrote to the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Queensland, Professor Deborah Terry, and told her about what I'd witnessed on my university campus. I also conveyed to her the fact that Camp Shalom, the Jewish camp on the University of Queensland, was subject to vile acts of intimidation that very night after I'd left. And I read a heart-rending email from a student at that university who was in the camp with his 2-year-old son about the impact of that on his 2-year-old son and how heartbreaking it was for him on my university campus. I also referred to the fact that there'd been a terrorist flag flown on the university campus, the flag of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And the PFLP has been declared a terrorist organisation by a number of our closest allies, responsible for aircraft hijackings, kidnappings, assassinations and murder. Absolutely despicable. A terrorist flag flown on my university. There was also the incident relating to intimidation of a UQ academic where a protest actually went into their office and urinated in their office and called on them to resign. We've seen it all: swearing, flag stealing, sign tearing, all of it. And then what does the University of Queensland do? It enters into an agreement. It gives a commitment to the protesters who are in the other encampment, issues a statement of commitment dated 1 June 2024 to those other students, and in that commitment, I've got it here, 3 pages, it doesn't even mention anti-Semitism. They couldn't even bring themselves to mention anti-Semitism. My university, in the context of this debate, they couldn't even bring themselves to mention anti-Semitism. Absolutely disgraceful. And this is what Camp Shalom member and liaison for an academic alliance against anti-Semitism, Yoni Nazarathi, said, and I quote, these are his words, a Jewish academic at my university. Seems like a commitment for keeping the door open to more harassment, vilification, hate speech and anti-Semitism on campus. The university has had a very slack response to a series of hate and vandalism events on campus during the past month. He said, with this, the statement negotiated with the anti-Israel camp has no explicit mention of anti-Semitism. Extraordinary. And opens the door for a series of more demands from anti-Zionist protesters. As such, the contributors to Camp Shalom have agreed to physically set up the camp on campus during the graduation days, July 8 to 12, in protest. Queensland Jewish Board of Deputies President Jason Steinberg said the university's decision to acquiesce to the protesters was absolutely abhorrent. And I quote from him, what they've done is open the door for anti-Israel, anti-Semitic activists to change the policies of the university, which was already an unsafe place for Jewish people. Now it's an even more unsafe place, he said. And following that, alumni of the University of Queensland have written an open letter to the Chancellor of the University of Queensland, Mr Peter Varghese, and to the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Deborah Terry, and I quote from that. Whatever anyone's view about the current war between Israel and Hamas terrorists, there is no excuse for bringing the hatred of that war into Queensland. That's what the anti-Israel supporters on your campus are doing in Queensland. They are directly attacking Jewish staff and students through their words, graffiti, posters and violent acts. And one of the signatories to that letter, and I commend him for it, is previous Chief Justice and Governor of Queensland, Paul de Jersey, an outstanding Queenslander. He's raised this issue as a former Chief Justice of the US Supreme Court and as former Governor of Queensland. This is an issue of grave, grave concern to the Jewish community in Queensland and to the Jewish staff and academics on the University of Queensland. I call upon the Labor Party to reconsider its position. If for nothing else, because the Jewish community of Australia is calling for this bill to be passed. How can you stand in the way of a bill calling for an inquiry, a judicial inquiry, into anti-Semitism on our university campuses and the management of that policy? How can you stand in the way of that inquiry when the Australian Jewish community is united in calling for it? I commend the mover of the bill, and I certainly look forward to supporting it.